Today we lift the lid on the love affair between Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, telling her side of the story for the first time. An explosive biography details the heir to the throne's decades-long infatuation with Camilla and his tormented marriage to the Princess of Wales. The book is written by Britain's top royal author Penny Junor, who was able to speak to Camilla's family and her confidants. Charles is said to have begged Camilla to call off her wedding to her first husband and to have wept the night before his marriage to Diana. Here is the first extract of Camilla's biography. One night, at a dinner party, the woman sitting next to Andrew Parker Bowles turned to him and smiled. "I'm really hurt, Andrew," she said teasingly. "I'm the only one of Camilla's friends you haven't made a pass at. What's wrong with me?" Everyone who knew the Parker Bowles well was aware of Andrew's serial unfaithfulness to Camilla, but it was passed off as a bit of a joke. It was nothing of the kind, of course. All too often, the women were indeed friends of his wife, and showed scant loyalty to her by succumbing to his charms. Yet Camilla never seemed to blame them or even have any stormy showdowns with Andrew. There was never a tense atmosphere in the couple's home, no barbed comments or bitter exchanges. Andrew's affairs were just a fact of life and not something Camilla often spoke about. It was only those closest to her who knew quite how standoffish and cold Andrew could be towards her, and how deeply, bitterly hurt she was by his infidelity. She loved him, for reasons her own family could never entirely fathom, and longed to be truly loved in return. But she didn't feel she was. There was always someone prettier, wittier, sexier, waiting to take her husband away from her. It wasn't that Andrew Parker Bowles was reacting against the ties of marriage. He had been unfaithful even when they were just going out. They had first met in March 1965 at Camilla Shan's coming-out party as a debutante. She was just 17 but remarkably self-assured. Andrew was then 25 and a rather beautiful officer in the household cavalry. Not only was he charming, smooth-talking and debonair but, thanks to his army training and riding, he was slim and fit. Another attraction was that he had noble blood and connections with royalty going back generations. His parents were close friends of the Queen Mother, and in 1953, at the age of 13, Andrew had been a page boy at the Queen's coronation. Now, most of the upper-class women in London seemed to be after him, some of them married and he knew it, and reaped the benefits. Camilla, hugely popular with boys from an early age, had caught his eye at her coming-out party and he had certainly caught hers. But they didn't meet again until 1966, at a dance in Scotland. He went over to her and said simply, "Let's dance." They danced, and she fell in love. It was the start of a long, torturous romance. Andrew was hugely fond of her and she was nominally his girlfriend, spending many weekends with him at his parents' house near Newbury in Berkshire. But he couldn't resist other women. And what was particularly hurtful was that even then many of them were Camilla's friends. 5 years later, however, there had still been no proposal. It was at this point that a good friend of Camilla's decided that she needed to meet the young and shy Prince of Wales. Lucia Santa Cruz, a glamorous Chilean historian, had got to know Charles 3 years before when he was an undergraduate at Trinity College, Cambridge. Back then, she had been working as a research assistant to the master of his college, Lord Butler. It was Butler who had invited her to dinner at the master's lodge to meet the prince, thinking they might enjoy one another's company. They did, they became lifelong friends but never in a romantic way. Although Lucia has repeatedly been credited with being the prince's first lover, this could not be farther from the truth. She already had a serious boyfriend, now her husband, and Charles is godfather to their eldest son. The introduction to Prince Charles was easy to arrange. One evening in 1971, when Lucia and the prince had already arranged to go out together, she asked him to arrive early. She had just the girl for him, she added, describing Camilla as having enormous sympathy, warmth, and natural character. Charles had recently been in Japan, where he had bought a little box as a present for Lucia. But once he knew he would be meeting Camilla, he brought a present along for her, too. In Lucia's first-floor flat that evening, there was an immediate attraction between Camilla and the prince, and an instant rapport. He loved the fact that she smiled with her eyes as well as her mouth, and laughed at the same silly things as he did. He also liked that she was so natural and easy and friendly, not in any way overawed by him, not fawning or sycophantic. In short, he was very taken with her, and after that first meeting he began ringing her up. Then they started seeing each other. But it was a busy time for him, and he was seldom at home. At 22, Charles was in the midst of intensive military training. He'd just qualified as a jet pilot with the Royal Air Force. Camilla was hugely fond of Charles and flattered by his attention. They'd had a very good time together, but Camilla was still in love with Andrew, who'd now returned to Britain. To her fury, the man she adored, while still nominally her boyfriend, was now seeing Princess Anne, Charles's feisty younger sister. This wasn't out of character, of course. Andrew had never been known to date just one girl at a time. This time, however, he seemed to be unusually smitten, and rumor had it that Anne was, too. During their time together, he was even invited by the Queen to join the family at Windsor Castle for Ascot Week. So there was certainly an element of tit-for-tat in Camilla's fling with Charles. Indeed, her principal motivation was to have some excitement and make Andrew jealous. She knew the affair with Charles would never go anywhere. Might she have felt differently if Charles had told her that he loved her, that he couldn't live without her and that he'd find some way of marrying her? It's impossible to know. However, not even those who know Camilla best are convinced that she would have said yes to him. True, Andrew had never been very nice to her. Even so, she was still stubbornly determined to marry him. The fact that every other woman in London fancied him only made him more attractive to her. She adored him, and she had been dating him through thick and thin for 7 years. She wanted to be Mrs. Parker Bowles, wife of her handsome cavalry officer, not Princess of Wales, not Queen. So in March 1973, while the prince was thousands of miles away in the West Indies, Andrew, now aged 33, finally asked Camilla to marry him. She accepted. Then she wrote to Charles herself to tell him. Her letter broke the prince's heart. In great distress, he fired off anguished letters of his own to his nearest and dearest. It seemed to him particularly cruel, he wrote in one letter, that after such a blissful, peaceful, and mutually happy relationship, fate had decreed that it should last a mere 6 months. He now had no one to go back to in England. I suppose the feeling of emptiness will pass eventually, he concluded mournfully. He did have one last-ditch attempt to get Camilla to change her mind, however. At the end of June 1973, the week before the wedding, he wrote asking her not to marry Andrew. Nevertheless, the wedding went ahead. Her mother Rosalind was not entirely happy about it. She thought Andrew didn't treat her daughter very well, but Camilla was determined. The wedding went ahead on July 4, 1973, shortly before her 26th birthday. She looked glorious in a traditional white dress, with a 10-feet train, by Belleville Sassoon. Her bridesmaids wore mini versions of her gown, while the page boys were in 19th-century military uniforms. The guest list included some of the most illustrious names in the country, among them the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, and Andrew's ex, Princess Anne. Charles was also invited but didn't come, claiming another engagement. Those close to him assumed that he stayed away for another reason. He simply couldn't bear to watch the woman he loved walk down the aisle with someone else. The newlyweds soon settled down to routine of weekdays mostly apart, with Andrew in London, and weekends normally together. Whenever he went back to London, he'd leave Camilla lists of chores to do in his absence. She and her friends used to laugh about the lists, most of which she ignored. Camilla was not built for work in those days. She did the bare minimum she could get away with, but she was a good homemaker and an excellent mother. The house was dark inside because of the leaded windows and low ceilings, but she brightened it with a mixture of antique and modern pieces, using pretty fabrics, plenty of table lamps and good rugs. There were books everywhere, and dozens of prints, paintings, cartoons, and photographs on the walls, while knick-knacks covered all available surfaces. Definitely shabby chic. Rather than, to use Camilla's expression, tickety-boo, it was a comfortable and happy home for her two children, Tom, born in 1974, and Laura Rose, 1978. To most outsiders, the Parker Bowles seemed to be a fortunate and very happy family. But appearances were deceiving. Because Andrew was spending his weekdays in London, he was never short of opportunities to be unfaithful. Charles had been heartbroken when he lost Camilla to Andrew, but however strong his feelings for her, life had to go on. He was young, he was attractive, he was eminently eligible, and he took out a succession of pretty girls, some of them suitable, some not, and some too sensible to want a future under the spotlight. Every woman he dated risked having her past raked over in the papers. Now approaching 30, he despaired of ever finding a bride. Meanwhile, although his affair with Camilla had ended before her marriage, it was inevitable that they'd continue to see one another. They had many friends in common, and went to many of the same sporting and social gatherings. Charles and Andrew were friends, and still played in the same polo team. Andrew was a great favorite of the Queen Mother, and she approved of his new wife. So did the Queen. Their mutual love of dogs and horses was a winning formula, and she got on famously with Camilla. When Tom was born, the Parker Bowles asked the prince to be their son's godfather, which further cemented the relationship between them all. They even arranged for the christening date to fit in with Charles's naval schedule. He finally left the Navy in 1977, the year of the Queen's Silver Jubilee, and the beginning of his full-time royal duties. This was also the year he dated Diana's eldest sister, the fiery, red-haired Lady Sarah Spencer. They'd met at a party at Windsor Castle, to which Andrew and Camilla, then pregnant with Laura, also came. But the relationship with Sarah came to an abrupt end when she told the press that Charles fell in love easily, but she wasn't in love with him. Such publicly bruising comments did nothing for his fragile ego. And where better to seek solace for life's knocks, setbacks and dilemmas than with Camilla? By the late 70s, she'd become quite simply his best friend. He drew from her strength and felt safe and comfortable around her. And he loved that he could talk to her openly and honestly about everything, knowing that nothing would go any further. Their friendship was purely platonic. And he visited often, enjoying being in a normal home, and just being around her and her small son, his godson. Friends of Camilla's would arrive at Bullhide to find Charles sitting on the floor, watching television with Tom, and do a double take when they realized who it was. As time went by, the nature of her relationship with Charles changed. In either 1978 or early 1979, after the birth of Laura, they became lovers again. This had not been in Camilla's game plan when she married Andrew. She was not a natural adulteress, and there had been no other men in her life apart from the Prince of Wales in all the years she had been with Andrew, despite his flagrant adultery, but she was tired of sitting at home in the country while he played around with other women. It was high time he knew how it felt. Andrew was in no position to complain, and when he discovered what was going on, he wisely didn't make a fuss. Some would say that a part of him actually quite enjoyed the fact that his wife was sleeping with the future king. He might have felt differently had Charles been a traveling salesman. Whatever the truth of that, Andrew wasn't overly worried about Camilla's affair. Members of the royal family picked up on it and warned that if news got out, it could be very damaging, not just to him as Prince of Wales but also to the institution. But by then, Charles was far too dependent on Camilla to be warned off by the risk of discovery.